Welcome to DEI during the year of tech layoffs. This has been a really hard year for many in the industry, and as Manara, we're really excited to be hosting this event. For those of you who don't know about Manara, my name is Ileana Montauk. I'm the CEO and co-founder. Our mission is to untap the full potential of tech talent from the Middle East and North Africa with a focus on Palestine and women in order to diversify and thus accelerate the growth of the global tech sector. Throughout our work, we end up interfacing with a lot of people who work in talent acquisition roles, in L&D roles, and in other roles where people care a lot about diversity and inclusivity and equity. And we partner with companies, including Google, to support companies like Google with their goals. It's through this work that we've had a chance to meet people like Oana, like Jill, like Thomas, who are here on our panel today, and to hear about some of the amazing things that they are doing, even when the industry is facing headwinds. Just a few quick things about the Middle East and North Africa. If you don't know, Manara exists in order to untap the full potential of tech talent in this region because it's really special in many ways. It has the highest youth population in the world with a youth bulge in demographics, larger investments in education than most OECD countries. And one thing that's really special about this region is the percentage of women who are studying in technical fields. That's a little bit about us, but why we're here today is to address what we're seeing a lot of partners in our work facing as a tough reality. This has been a year with more than 200,000 layoffs globally across hundreds of tech companies, and women being more impacted by these layoffs than the general kind of statistics. The DEI roles in particular have been impacted. We've heard about this recently, and we're seeing more challenges at various organizations such as BBC, Zalando, or Nike. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of companies who are making progress, who may be facing similar challenges in making progress, or who may be facing opportunities in this market. For this agenda today, we've taken the topic based off of conversations that we've had with many of our partners and potential partners. And we are going to be addressing questions that come up frequently, including how do you even measure DEI efforts? How do you measure that they're having the impact that's intended? What do you do if you can't measure the results, or if you're not able to measure them at the extent that your company would like to be able to measure them? How do you prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion in the current climate? What are some of the opportunities that the current climate presents, or things that can be done even if you are facing challenges? And finally, what are some of the costs if companies are facing some challenges in making those investments today? And how can that help to make sure that the right investments are made even in the current market? So bottom line, it's a very different time out there for many of us than it was a year ago. What are some really practical tips that we can take away? For this session, please introduce yourself once the chat is live. Don't worry about it as long as the chat is not live. We really wanted to create a safe space for those who are at the front lines, talent teams and DEI teams, and anyone else who views themselves as an advocate of DEI. So please do feel free to share your own perspectives. We'll make sure that during the Q&A, there's a long time for you to ask your questions on what's on your minds. So we'll be spending about 30 minutes with Jill, Thomas, and Oana discussing their lessons learned. I will facilitate that conversation. After that, we'll make sure to save at least 20 minutes for you to ask your questions. You can ask your questions throughout. If it's appropriate, we'll answer your questions live during the session. If not, we'll save them for the end. You can post those questions either in the chat if it goes live, or just use the Q&A feature. The session is going to be recorded. It's already recorded right now, and we'll be recording it for the purpose of sharing out valuable lessons that are shared during the session. But we also really want to maintain this as a safe space to have a really honest conversation about the challenges that you're facing. So feel free to post a question and just write in it that you'd prefer that it not be shared out later, and we'll make sure to request that. The speakers already know as well that if they share anything that is a little bit sensitive or private, even if they don't mention so today during the session, they'll have a chance to say so later to make sure that that does not get shared out later. And with that, we are ready to go ahead and get started. I am thrilled to be introducing these speakers. Very briefly, Thomas is the person who manages our partnership at Google. I've had the pleasure of knowing Thomas now for over a year, and Thomas has moved from the United States to Europe for his role. Jill is between London and Berlin, managing talent at HelloFresh, but also playing a leadership role when it comes to DEI. And Oana was until recently at various tech companies, including Wayfair, and has moved on now to run her own company related to diversity and inclusion. I'm going to be turning it over to the speakers to share more of an intro. Let's go ahead and start with you, Thomas. Tell us a little bit about your role at Google and anything else from your background that's going to inform what you're able to bring to the table today for this conversation.
Sure. Thanks for having me, and it's good to have folks in the room for this discussion. My name is Thomas Harwell. I currently lead the diversity recruiting team for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa at Google. And so what that means is across the 33 countries where we recruit, we have some commitments to women in tech, Black and brown or other racial and ethnic minorities or historically underrepresented or marginalized groups, and folks with disabilities. And how do we create a workforce and access to our workforce that is going to be supportive and inclusive of the intersection of experiences for those folks? Additionally, prior to being at Google, I spent about 10 years or so in the education sector, in higher education, working in the United States. And so prior to coming to Google, I was actually going to pursue my PhD in how diversity works and functions in this sort of corporate setting. So it's a huge area of intellectual interest of mine. And shout out to Emma McGinty on my team, who actually manages the day-to-day partnership with Manara and the work that you all do, Ileana. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Thomas. And Emma, I know you're here as an attendee. Thrilled to have you, and thank you for everything that you do. Jill, over to you for your intro.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jill. I lead on recruitment delivery for tech and non-tech at HelloFresh. Funnily enough, just coming up to my first anniversary this year. I also have a couple of responsibilities for some OKRs, one of which is around diversity and inclusion. And we're focusing on gender at HelloFresh right now. And that's probably no surprise to a lot of people tuning in, because I think that's a usual sort of starting point. But I'd love to talk a little bit about our approach and how that is very much a starting point, but it's something that we're going to scale for other areas that are underrepresented. So yeah, I've been working on diversity for about 13 or 14 years now. Before that time, I'll be embarrassed to say I just thought it kind of happened. And now I've sort of seen the light and I get pretty passionate about it. So yeah, really excited to be here today. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you, Jill. And it was your passion when we met and some of the very practical tips that you shared that inspired us to invite you to be on this panel. Really looking forward to some of the things you share. And I hope you do it with just as much passion as I know you do in your day-to-day job. And Oana, over to you for your introduction.
Hello, everybody. Great to be here and amazing to see so many people attending. I know a lot of former colleagues as well, and maybe future ones. My name is Oana Iordachescu. I am a talent advisor and DEI consultant for large and medium organizations. For the past 10 years or so, I've led a few large recruitment teams and strategic DEI programs. I was lucky to work with folks in Booking.com in Amsterdam, Criteo in Paris, and lastly, Wayfair in Berlin. I currently host a podcast, shameless plug here. It's called We Include, where I interview founders of businesses for good and looking to launch more initiatives to amplify any projects that like influence inclusion in the workplace. So I'm happy to be part of this conversation and share my insights.
Thank you so much. And let's just jump right in because there's going to be so much to share on our main topic. So what are some of the challenges that you're seeing now compared to, let's say, a year or two ago in this industry, in this problem space? And if you want to jump straight to solutions, feel free to start sharing those as well. Jill, I'm going to call on you first, but let's make this conversation super interactive. Thomas and Oana, feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in as you see fit.
Yeah, I mean, budget is always a big challenge, right? But our budget was set and we haven't had it cut. So I'm really pleased to say that. So we're continuing on. Frankly, I think the biggest challenge for us in achieving our targets is changing the mindset. And so I trying to do this on two fronts. Firstly, I want to get some fire in the bellies of the recruiters. If they don't believe it's important, they're never, ever in a million years going to be able to convince their hiring managers. And the second thing is, with the initiatives that we're running, is making it important to the interviewing teams who are meeting candidates, that they should be seeing people who don't look and sound like them. They should be getting used to seeing people from different backgrounds, from different parts of their lives that they don't normally come across, so that this is not the norm and they get used to not seeing the norm. That's the whole point of what we want to do. So can I say that anything has drastically changed since last year? As you know, as you say, the landscape's changed? No, not really. It's just continuing to beat the drum.
Let's just dig in a little bit more to what you shared before we move on to Thomas and Oana for your perspectives. When you're working with recruiters and hiring managers in this way and trying to convince them to look at more candidates who are different, what are they saying are some of the challenges that they're facing on the front lines? And what are you finding yourself having to do as a leader to get those challenges addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the impact that you have as a recruiter on your organization, you're the gatekeeper, aren't you? You bring the talent in. So a lot of what happens depends on the caliber of your recruiters and their passion to deliver what you need them to deliver. So last week, I have a team leader call and people rock up for this. And it's all about sort of getting the team leaders on board to get their recruiters to think more holistically about their pipelines, because everybody's got time to hire and time to fill and stats to you know, achieve. But actually, I want to look at the quality and the deliverables around having a better set of talent that we're presenting to the business. So last week we had a meeting and I said, you know, we had the first agenda item. The second one was called toilets. And everybody perked up. What's she going to talk about? Why is it called toilets? And actually, I was sort of referring to some reading that I'd done from a book called Invisible Women. This book makes me so furious. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to finish it. But in there, they talk about the floor space for toilets being the same when they're designed for men and for women. And it's just not the same. It takes a woman 2.3 times longer to go to the loo than a man. So why would it be the same floor space? And I said to the recruiters, so are you doing this then? Is it an equal floor space moment for your candidate pipeline? Or are you being a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more provocative in terms of what you're producing, you know, to the hiring team, so that we're going to get a better result for our candidates? We have to think a little bit more differently and a little bit more purposefully about what we're trying to achieve and the outcomes, rather than trying to say to ourselves, yeah, we've got it fine. Well, we've got equal numbers going through the pipeline. It's not okay. And that's not going to get us the results that we need.
We'll come back to some more questions on that topic in a second. For now, Thomas, over to you for the challenges that you're seeing either at Google or elsewhere in the industry, because I know that you're also keeping a pulse on what else is going on.
Yeah, I think broadly, you said between a year ago and now, and that automatically sends me into like a quote post-COVID world. And so I think when I think about the number of countries that we work in, different countries had different norms during COVID, had different expectations, what people are expected to do and deliver now coming out of COVID. How many remote opportunities are there versus on-site? How much access to data? What was the impact on women, mostly going back into caretaking responsibilities? So I think there is still a lot of the COVID impact that we have to deal with as we think about diversifying our workforce, and how we shape something that is globally aligned to this idea of a much more diverse workforce, but locally and culturally relevant in the realities of what different communities are going through day to day. And so that is where my head goes when you ask about a year ago versus today.
And what does that mean for the day-to-day, and what's an approach that you or your team are taking to handle that type of change?
I think one of the pieces is the importance of partnerships, right? Like my team is largely based between London, Dublin, and Zurich, with some representation in Nairobi. But when we think about the other countries that we support, how are we learning about the experience of people? What is it that they really need? And so really having great invested partners, people who are familiar with these communities, can talk to the challenges or opportunities that we might have as a company like Google to help me make informed decisions about where we're tapping into talent, where we're missing out on talent, and how we might reshape some of our processes or initiatives to bring in that diverse workforce.
And what's an example? I mean, I can think of some that I've shared with your team, but curious what you're seeing elsewhere with other partners. What's an example of something that you've learned through a partnership or something you've been able to achieve through a partnership that you wouldn't have been able to with the team that you mentioned, which does not cover all of EMEA, right? And that's so often the case that EMEA teams are actually based in Europe, run by people who understand the European market, but not really achieving the reach that EMEA teams are going to need to be achieving very soon, if not already.
I think one of the interesting conversations that we're in the middle of is the role of remote working and what kind of access remote working can provide for certain communities versus being in office. And Google prides itself now on our hybrid culture, but really trying to make sure that we're opening as much access as we can where that will enable us to diversify our workforce. So remote working and the hybrid working reality is one that's super top of mind in how we're operating at Google right now.
Thank you, Thomas. Oana, what are some of the primary challenges that you're seeing now versus a year ago? And you cover so many different companies now with the business that you run. So, feel free to share things that you saw at Wayfair or anything that you're seeing in the market overall.
I see quite a bit, and specifically in tech, having in mind that the pressure is so high, all the organizations have kind of gone a little bit inward towards revenue streams. And I think this somehow forced DEI leaders, but also DEI champions in organizations to be very mindful. The conversation I had in the last 6 months revolve around what can we do better and really do it sustainably, from tooling that we buy and kind of utilize. Are we maximizing how we utilize that? And so tooling, I found HR tech being a very big piece in this conversation, especially in the European space as we move incorporating more AI and incorporating more kind of nurturing talent pools, because we should do that. There is a very big investment and the questions are more serious, I would say. Let's do this the right way for the right reason on a sustainable manner. And I think the second effect that I've seen, because now the TA teams, the talent teams, and the hiring leaders need to think in sync. They seem to ask a little bit more the questions correlated between people we bring in, so attraction and hiring, and people that we have inside, so the retention piece. There's a lot of conversation about creating the right environment and making sure the right people stay, and not see that effect that you presented at the beginning, where 40%, like a disproportionate amount of people are affected by the layoffs from minority backgrounds, which is not where we're looking to go. So these, for me, have been two of the biggest challenges for people just to position themselves in what we would say it's a mature DEI model within an organization.
And what are you seeing what are some of the things you're seeing that are working, that companies are still able to do, Oana, with those challenges at this time?
One big thing, because I've milited for this a long time, we can't do everything inside. So going outside and hiring that expert, partnering with those organizations that really help you have access to talent from diverse backgrounds has been a little bit of a shift. And I think there's also a realization that it doesn't cost us more. First of all, having in mind that people were overspending internally on a lot of like growing teams and not necessarily getting that effect. So I see somehow a realization and maybe a bit of a balancing the market, right? You had very large players in the DEI space as experts, and now you start seeing more segmentation and localization where you need it, a little bit what Manara is doing as well.
You mentioned the topic of retention, and something that I'm seeing a lot of companies focus on right now is retention, because in many cases, I know it's not necessarily the case at HelloFresh right now, Jill, but in a lot of other companies, hiring plans have slowed down. And that's the reality in teams that until pre-COVID were being pushed to recruit more than you've ever had to recruit before. Hiring plans were really accelerating and going global and going remote, as you mentioned, Thomas. All of a sudden, it went from like one of the largest hiring sprees in history to one of the slowest ones in a long time, right? And then that also created the opportunity to work on retention more when teams didn't have to invest their time on recruiting. I see a question that's actually been put in the chat regarding retaining talent. And so let's go ahead and address that one. Whoever wants to go first, curious to hear what you guys are doing around retention. And do you find that you have more time? Is this to work on retention? Is this really an opportunity for companies right now?
I mean, I can jump in. I mentioned I was working on 2 OKRs. One's diversity, the other one is internal mobility. And actually, you know, when you're a company that's been growing pretty furiously, you then don't want to have to keep doing that, right? You want to retain all of that great talent that you've just hired. So we're doing quite a lot of work on retention, on opening up, you know, opportunities, making sure that we can broadcast more clearly the vacancies that we have. Of course, we have some targets around that we monitor every quarter in the same way as we're doing diversity. So there's still a focus on, you know, keeping the talent that you bring in.
Yeah, so I have partner teams who obviously support the more broad Google ecosystem on retention, but one of the things that we just did within our organization, or just kicked off, we'll have a series of meetings, is really going through our organization by role and title, name by name, and asking ourselves as a leadership team, do we have exposure to the right persons, the talent that we want to invest in, who's going to be integral to how we move forward? Where are they positioned for the right scale and scope of work within our org? And so I think, Ileana, it takes a level of due diligence, it takes a level of time commitment, it takes a level of just really sitting down and saying, do we know where people want to be, where they want to head, and does that fit with the future of this organization? And different organizations will do it different ways, but we are literally right now going down name by name in our 400-person organization and doing that.
Oana, if you want to jump in, please do.
Yeah, I think for sure, if you can do that, do that. And I think this is definitely a way. I've seen some models where people start kind of mapping out what type of communities do we have internally, or what type of communities do we have best chances from attracting for. And an example here would be parents and caregivers. And with this shift back in the office, what does that mean? How are we making sure that these people, while, as Thomas mentioned at the beginning, their obligations or their structure or their family dynamics have changed post-COVID, or some things are prioritized, is the employer also adapting to that? And are we specifically asking these communities, what do you need in order to thrive? Because it might be very different from a B or C or D community that we identify within that workforce. So on top of it, let's say this kind of nitty-gritty fine detail, some kind of a heat map around the needs for specific communities are very, very welcome in terms of retention, because they just bring to light things that you estimated everybody needs, but ultimately they're just very specific needs that you need to map out and provide, of course.
On this topic, Oana, timely, I'm having a conversation with a colleague at another organization, and they're talking about introducing what they're calling an inclusion passport. And so essentially where you have your profile of your, you know, a lot of medium and large companies, you could say things like, you know, I have 3 kids. It's really hard for me to meet before 8 or after. I'm a member of whatever community, and so therefore I prioritize X, Y, or Z. And this is all types and dimensions of inclusion, not just some of the, you know.
And there might be temporary ones as well, right? They're not might be like, let's say, identity driven. That might be situational,
Exactly.
and they're very important to care for that, for sure. And yeah, those employers win.
Yeah.
Thomas, I love that idea of an inclusivity profile, just to make sure that our audience understood it and that we all understood it. Is that like a user manual where everyone, when they're working with somebody at the company, they can click in and see something about that person and how to best work with them?
That's how it's been pitched to me. And this is a relatively large organization that's considering using something like this. But yeah, essentially where you have your profile, you could also add some multidimensionality to who you are as a person and what it looks like for you to be successful at work across all different dimensions. And one of the things that I really like is that they're not just centering marginalized groups, right? The expectation would be that all folks would participate in this exercise, and it would make for a better culture for everyone.
What about the role of data when it comes to retention? Is that something that you guys are measuring? How are you finding that working or not working? And are you even able to measure? I mean, in Europe, there's so little data that you are actually able to measure legally, right?
In the mobility policy that we've been reviewing, yeah, there is quite a bit. You know, you've got employee engagement surveys that tell you, you know, are they looking elsewhere? Are they feeling at home? You've got attrition data that tells you when they leave. We can see when people are typically thinking of leaving. So yeah, I mean, when we put the policy together, we basically had a little timeline that told us what was on an employee's mind. And then we looked at our policy and said, well, you know, basic questions like, if they're thinking of leaving on X date, why would we limit them to when they can apply? Because if we limit them here, they've already handed the notice in here. You know, does that really make sense? And so, you know, you end up maybe writing something that is very tailored for the organization and might not fit for other companies. But if you're really writing it around the current employee experience, then you have to get really tailored and specific about that.
Go ahead, Thomas, because I think you're more in it now.
I love the conversation on data. And to your point, Ileana, there are GDPR restrictions and other things, which I think goes to Oana's earlier point about the importance of effective tooling. Like, are your tools integrating what you need from a policy and data perspective? Data is helpful and can be very helpful. To your point, there are limitations. What I often tell people though is don't let data mask your problem or your opportunity, right? And so depending on the size of your organization or the size of your team, you don't need data that says, you know, 20% of your employee base who is Black needs a mentor, right? You don't need big D data if I'm the only Black person on your team. Just ask me, do I need support? Do I have a mentor? Do I have? So I think sometimes because we have access to a lot of information, a lot of big D data, we get caught up in searching for that when actually the decisions that need to be made are evident in what we say we value and how we want to show up to support any employee or any team member. And so don't let having or not having this super intersectional cut of a very specific thing like make you not engage in the way that you know is right. But yes, data is an interesting topic. Our leaders love data. They want to see it cut 6 ways from Sunday, but it doesn't change some of the moments that matter.
I want to push you on that though, Thomas, because that works when your leadership agrees with you, when everyone aligns, or when the decision is in your control, right? Like you're working on a specific team, you know, somebody needs a mentor, you ask them and you provide them with a mentor. But when it comes to influencing people above who are asking for data cut in 6 different ways, like you just said, how do you have the conversation you just had with us about data with those people?
I always go back to the principle of starting with the end in mind. What is the ultimate outcome that we're trying to achieve, right? And even if I don't have access to data, again, big data, most of my leaders would agree that they want their employees to have a positive work experience, that they want them to contribute to the values or mission of the organization, that they want them to hit their sales or quota revenue target, that they want them to develop their product in the timeline that's needed, right? And so if there are barriers to that, whether or not they are measured at scale, or if I can say, I know that there are 3 people who are struggling with these things, how do we support them? We agree on the end goal, right? And so I think making sure that you have alignment about what the values are in your system, what you want to achieve for your workforce, will enable you to maybe have some different dialogues than I need to prove every piece of what I'm driving forward.
And you wrote about this recently, right? This idea of how do you convince teams? Anything else that you want to add on that topic?
I think depending on how you get into this work, because you believe in what a fair and equitable workforce looks like, remember that most organizations are either time or financially resource constrained, or I tell my team, Google is a time poor place. Mm-hmm. People who are at Google do not have a lot of time. So you need to make sure that you're leveraging whatever the appropriate set of opportunity costs is, and that you're focusing whatever engagement or activity is to the right audience, that you're making the most impact for the resources that you're leveraging. And the reality is there has to be a limiting resource factor to any sort of set of strategic plans. And I think remembering that will help you speak more effectively to some of your senior leaders.
Yeah, and I love how when you wrote about that, it wasn't just about convincing people, it was about taking an iterative process to achieving goals, just like you would for product development, and being aware of where can you inform those with data, but where can you also inform that with qualitative results when data might not be available. Anything else you wanted to add to that? Because I know Oana's been wanting to share.
Oh, he is ready. I'm ready. I have my notes. I have my notes out.
No, but like this is a call out for those listening, to be honest, because I'm sure everybody on this webinar has influenced some leaders. So if you can put in chat like what type of methods or what type of kind of actions worked for you, we can all learn from each other. I just want to add two things. I love all the examples already shared. One that classically has worked for me, let's say for more C-level type of leaders, was to go and take external details, right? Like McKinsey has a lot of reports. You have like proper research that if you think it's not representative for you, you live in a weird bubble, right? So it always kind of highlighted some things that statistically, by society's bias, we will be in that situation. Let's say, again, bringing the caregiver aspect, you have promotion gaps for caregivers. This is statistically relevant across cultures. So can you look at your inside organization? And this has worked. And the second, it might sound like it's totally the other spectrum, but your leaders are also emotional folks, right? Like we are driven by emotion. Everybody either has at home some situations, some friends, some family that have stories and they relate to that. So I would always dig in that. Plus, I've had that situation where I've had a CTO many years ago who's like, we have no problem. We need to focus on our technical debt. We need to break them on. We have other priorities, right? Until we highlighted the fact that there is a very significant engagement difference between, let's say, male population and female population. And then we had the CTO sit down moderating the focus groups to understand why. And that burned, okay? So sometimes have the data, bring all the sources, but don't forget the emotional piece that we all work with ultimately on a day-by-day basis. That's all. That's what I wanted to add because everything is so relevant.
I mean, I'd really echo exactly that. The 2 points in time that have really mattered to me to influence, and when I would have walked away from that meeting being completely gutted, you know, because I'd worked so hard on something. Both times I got it over the line because of an employee story, you know, and I held up the person, said, this is so-and-so, you know, this is their experience. And exactly as you said, Oana, you can't shy away from that, especially if you choose somebody they know. It's, you know, it's not just a stat. And that seems to get the story home.
Jill, another thing that you've done to bring the story home is things like the toilet story, right? Any other examples like that where you've come with almost branding for something that really opens up people's eyes?
Oh, yeah. Gosh, and I really bored a town planner yesterday at a party that I was at. When I knew he was a town planner, I was like, I'm going to have to send you a link for this book. Something else that we did that really worked was, and I know somebody's put in the chat, look, we always start with gender, but what about other groups? I worked for a business that put a lot of store in graduates, and we were hiring like 46% of our hires were sort of first and second jobbers. And I just felt, and more to the point, my head of early careers felt that we were missing out on talent because we were hiring for a job that actually didn't need somebody to have a degree. And so we were using video interviewing at the time. And this is the kind of video interviewing where you send the link and they answer the questions and then you watch the video back afterwards. And she started putting into assessment centers wildcard candidates, where she was like, do you trust me enough to give you, you know, a good set of candidates? Yes, we trust you. So she'd put in there people without degrees. And then they'd meet them, having seen their video interviews, they'd really hook onto, God, they look really great. I want to meet them. And then she'd put them through the assessment center and they want to hire them. And then would come the big reveal. Oh, by the way, they don't have a degree. And so it was this whole like wild card, like subversive kind of hiring, if you like, you know, that just really held at the mirror and said, look, you say you want a degree, but honestly you don't. And now you've seen somebody that doesn't, you know, we're driving the point home. So yeah, a little bit of guerrilla hiring there.
I love that story. And I think that's a really great example of how people don't know what they're looking for until they see a candidate. And if they're only expecting to see people of a certain profile or somebody who looks like them, they're going to miss out on great talent. And that video trick is a way to get them to be willing to even show up to that interview, or just hiding certain facts about the candidate.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing.
I loved hearing about her wildcards.
I'm seeing some questions coming in. I want to make sure we have time for those, but before we transition to those, let's just give the mic to each speaker to share one more story, one more tip, one more hardship you've seen people face, and ways to get past that hardship right now in the current environment. Anything that you would like this audience to walk away with, and feel free to unmute yourselves in order of whoever's inspired to go first.
I think not knowing who's on the call, one of the things that I would offer folks who are at smaller or medium organizations, or maybe their own really small team focus on DEI, is try to let go of that desire to be all things to all people, and really focus on what the one or two big issues or priority areas are for your people plan, your people strategy related to diversity or inclusion. I think showcasing to your leadership some of those wins will open up more space for what you can do in the future. And so just being diligent about that, because otherwise I remember a time in my career where I would spread myself too thin and not feel like any of the impact was coming into fruition. And I think honing in on the focus has really allowed me to push forward some things that will have some long-term impact.
Amazing. I want to say, whenever I work with people who, first of all, not all companies even have a team or a person whose job is officially DEI, right? So many companies have it spread across somebody else's role that's already in charge of a lot of other things. And even if there is one person or a small team in charge of it, it's the whole scope, all the way from recruiting for all different roles, right? All the way to retention for all different types of roles. So being really laser focused on achieving success. And Thomas, if I can add to what you said, recognizing that it could take a few iterations, and it's not a commitment that you just nail it in one quarter, right? Who else had something that you'd like to add for this audience to take away from today's webinar?
I saw a question there about referrals, and this is a bit of a hot topic. As a little quick sort of like practical tip, and we all have different ATSs, right? But there was one ATS that I was using, I think it might have been Greenhouse, that implemented a anonymized referral process, so that the person who referred the candidate was anonymous. The candidate was also anonymous. And that really helped us to nail those, my best friend, we were golfing, their nephew needs a job kind of moment, you know, and it helped us to really weed those out and not give those preferential treatment. I think that's, and ask any recruiter, we've all had those moments when, you know, somebody important's put forward their son, daughter / insert whatever.
Thank you, Jill, so much for sharing that. Oana, what's another tip that you'd like to share?
Don't go alone. It can be an isolating type of work, especially when you directly impact people's well-being, right? Like if you're successful, you're like, yay. If you're not, it feels like it's your fault. It's not. Ultimately, it's a group effort. And the way I kept the energy throughout all these years is making sure I have allies, whether they are hiring managers, whether they are even, the office manager, and kind of asks proactively, what do you need for this interview accommodation? Like creating some sort of network of awareness. I am not joking. I think for years, every time I would see somebody opening a door, getting into an elevator, going for a coffee, I was like, let me tell you what I'm doing on DEI. And then those became my champions. Those became my buddies somehow. And those who actually put the message that I was trying to put in talent acquisition or talent, even when I was not in the room. And that was somehow key for an easier work, to be honest, but also this feeling that you're not alone. So don't go alone. I think this is my big advice. And yeah.
Amazing. Thank you all for sharing that. That's such real stories from the front lines. I'm going to transition it over to the questions because we have so many people on this call and we want to make sure that we actually address what's on people's minds. If you are in attendance and you haven't already posted your questions, please do use the Q&A feature to do that. and also vote on questions, because what I'm going to do here is go in order of those that have the most upvotes, just to make sure that we really address what's on your minds. So the first one is from Andrea. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And the question is, how would you be managing the GDPR limitations in case you're developing diverse candidate communities to nurture, possibly through a CRM? So I think mostly what we're talking about here is just often in a CRM, you might not even be able to see all the different nuances of how somebody may or may not come from a diverse background with GDPR. Whoever wants to answer it, feel free to unmute.
I'll go because I think there's one ahead of that too that is a little bit for me. I think in the first question about best ways to include diverse new hires, we think about the employee lifecycle full span from recruiting to exiting and maybe even returning, right? And so as much of a plan as you have for your recruiting function, you should also be asking your partner and the rest of the HR function, how does that feed into what we're doing across the rest of the employee lifespan, and putting some of the mapping that Jill talked about to play for the types of experiences we want folks to have and go with. As that ties to the GDPR, you have to make some assumptions. You have to decide who is in the best position to say, while we may not know this exact intersection of data, what is it that we want folks to have an experience? What is it that we believe to be true? In some cases, we may get it wrong, but we need to use the best, most informed space of what we have to put in place what we think will be a sustainable people experience and nurturing experience for our employees. Again, you can't let the lack of or limitation of data prevent you from doing or achieving what you want for your people. So that would be how I would answer it.
Thank you. Any other? Yeah, go ahead, Oana.
Thank you, Andrea, for the question. I would like to encourage everybody on this call to challenge their legal department and make a friend in the legal department. GDPR is not that scary, to be honest. And if the tools that you're using or the partners that you're having understand that, one of the biggest limitations is where the data is stored. So as long as we work, let's say, with US companies or Chinese companies, we need to kind of figure that out. If they are European, already your limitations are much less, right? So the server data storage is one big piece, and then the anonymization. And a lot of what I've seen, it's actually easy to do. So it's a matter of will. We need to ask our providers to create that type of data anonymization. So be diligent, educate yourself eventually, but make also a friend in the legal department.
I love that point, Oana, and the amount of time that I spend with my legal team saying, okay, well, if, then, okay, you said that, but if, then, like, it just is hours, and they're tired of me and I'm tired of them. But we do often come to a solution that is much more progressive than maybe where we would have been otherwise.
Which is, again, maybe a reminder to keep the focus very focused, because everything's going to take longer than you expected it to, right? Including that kind of back and forth with the legal team. Jill, anything you wanted to add on that topic? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. All right. So the next one here is, most companies with mature growing recruitment tend to cling to OKRs focused just on gender diversity. And I think maybe this is coming from a European context where we're seeing a really big focus on gender diversity. It does leave ethnicities and other backgrounds behind. What kind of discussion can we have with leadership to change the diversity mindset to be more inclusive? Jill, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I mean, just because you're focusing on gender doesn't mean to say that you can't then split that group even further, right? What we're doing at HelloFresh is implementing Rooney Rule. So it's about the number of candidates, actually, female candidates in this case, that are coming through to a hiring manager interview. But that doesn't mean to say there can't be, people of color or different nationalities or different socioeconomic groups. And also this whole methodology is about just getting our interviewing teams used to meeting different kinds of candidates. So I think this is something that will help us scale. So I hear what you're saying about it being gender in other groups, but at least for us this year, honestly, this is the first time I'm trying it. So let's chat next year and see how it's gone. But I'm doing it all with a lens of, I want to switch this up at the end of the year and take those learnings so that hopefully we'll be a little bit more focused for the next group that we want to tackle.
Thomas, Oana, anything to add on this question?
As an American myself, I am not a big fan of the Rooney Rule, but I know Jill's team is probably deep in the weeds of how to make it super impactful and the need for more than one person from each identity group and those kinds of things that really come into place. For us at Google, we actually have country-specific plans, Ileana, where we say, gender, we're focused on across the board everywhere that we recruit, but in this country, diversity looks like this. And sometimes it's race, sometimes it's faith, sometimes it's disability. And so really, to Jill's point, trying to divide up and be really laser focused on the dimensions of diversity that are going to add to our overall organizational makeup. And you can see some of the efforts of that work in our diversity annual report, which is public, and you can see how it's evolved over the years globally. It might be a good case study for some folks.
Yeah, this is a major pain point. And I know, for example, already in the UK, while there were a serious advancement in kind of identifying a certain group, let's say people of color, BAME, now we're pulling the terminology away, we're reinventing some things. I think it's normal and it's good that we continue to have these conversations to create the right terminology. To Thomas's point, every country has its own compliance legislation. So most of the Western European countries actually have a requirement for organizations to prove that they have a certain percentage of people with disabilities. That is mostly not happening, and companies are paying huge fines to governmental institutions for not declaring that. How about we actually put that money somewhere else, right? So there's a lot of opportunity. Religious diversity as well. It's a bigger factor, I would say, in Libya, for example, or Lebanon, for example, where I was at the conference once and I was talking about gender, and they were like, you know what, we're kind of fine, but we really have people asking us to hire Sunni versus Shiite, and that's a problem that we have. So understanding that local reality is very important. And again, whether you talk to people in your organization that could highlight that for you, educate yourself, or hire a consultant from those specific areas for like a quick deep dive helps, but it is a very spiky problem indeed. And I appreciate those who are thinking intersectionally at the moment, and they're trying to understand what can I do beyond gender.
The next question seems somewhat related, and I see it got a lot of upvotes as well, so let's go ahead and tackle it. What are some strategies to promote socioeconomic diversity effectively? This person who asked the question, Irina, seems to have loved the wildcard strategy mentioned by Jill and is looking for some additional very practical tips.
This is a tough one, but I've just been at a coffee today talking about some of the questions that the UK recently inserted into their census to try to get at some social mobility and socioeconomic status. The questions I think about free lunch, what your parents did when you were 14, like different things. I'm curious to hear what the other panelists have to say, but for me, when we talk about socioeconomic mobility, I often talk about proxies. What are the best indicators that we can come up with in any given space for that distribution? Is it location in a specific country, right? Outside of it, when we think about a city versus a more rural area, access to opportunities like that, how can we get at proxies where we don't have a clear agreement about how our socioeconomic status is defined in any given country?
Oana, go on.
I haven't seen anything very mature developed until now. The only pathway that I've seen more actually in the Eastern European countries, or again, Middle East, is going outside the major educational centers. So not going for the top universities that in general would be more costly, more expensive, more accessible to people who had, mentors and tutoring and all that. So going outside this top 5 universities in some countries, usually that would capture actually a more diverse socioeconomic background of folks. But I give you that. I think from where I am in Romania, one of these categories would be the Roma community. So again, identifying those historically discriminated communities and just assuming somehow that they still need a leveling field, right? Like I think those are the 2 areas that I've seen. And again, each country would have its own communities with that. Education for me is a very good point to start.
I think graduate recruitment is a massive engine, isn't it, for hiring teams? It takes a lot of time and energy. And I think in the last couple of years, I've seen appetite for people to pivot towards other methods of entry, like apprenticeships, and also maybe veteran hiring or military hiring programs. So maybe, again, perhaps a little bit subversive, but maybe like repurposing 1 or 2 heads of people that usually do graduate recruitment to getting them to take a little bit of a more of a project on around looking at some apprenticeship hiring or some military hiring programs to get other talent streams coming into your business. Would just change the mix of people who are making the decisions about where they want to hire these people from. So those people will come in, they'll become promoted, and then they're making the decisions about where to hire and whether or not you need somebody with a degree to do your expenses.
I'm just going to add one thing to this whole answer, which is in our community at Manara, we often see that people are going through that social economic mobility, and the biggest challenge is preparing for the interview process and just being given a chance to interview. And sometimes what we've seen is giving people a chance to intern or even hiring a few people who don't go through an interview process in a traditional way, giving them a work sample as an interview process instead of a typical kind of live coding interview, for instance, can open up doors to people who are very effective, but just don't know how to go through a typical interview process, which I think is a big challenge for people coming through that social economic mobility background. I'm seeing a lot more questions. We're not going to be able to get through all of them in 4 minutes. Thomas, while I choose one more, I'm going to just send you a quick one here, which is a follow-up to an earlier one. It's, why aren't you a fan of the Rooney Rule, and is there an alternative that you've adopted instead?
There's lots of literature about the Rooney Rule that you can go out and read. Specifically, it was shaped in the NFL and having one racial or ethnic minority, mostly Black coach interview for head coaching jobs. But what that meant was that they were passing talent around. There wasn't the ability to convert talent. I think a lot of folks that are looking to use something like the Rooney Rule, which again is not my space of advocacy, are setting the expectation that you have at least 2 people from whatever group you're focused on. So if you're focused on women, that you have at least 2 women, and then the likelihood of you hiring a woman into a role is exponentially higher than just the minimum of 1, which is the literal translation of the Rooney Rule. So, but there's loads and loads of literature and research out there. You just type making the Rooney Rule work, and something will come up, and you can read it there. But that's why I'm not a big fan.
All right. So as we wrap up, I'm going to suggest that every speaker address any question that you've seen that you might be particularly passionate about, if you've had a chance to keep an eye on them. If not, then the one I'm going to choose for the rest of you, for us to wrap up on, is this one around tips on how to achieve DEI in a complex global organizational environment. So Jill, you mentioned at the start of the call how it's different in different countries. Oana, you've mentioned it as well. Igor is asking for context. His team has reach over Middle East, Africa, and Europe, all different DEI environments. Any tips for companies that are across so many different countries?
When I was at Premier Farnell, we had a very, very diverse mix at one of our sites, and we did everything around food. And we just got people from different backgrounds to cook like a favorite dish, and we just hosted a big lunch, and then that just kind of grew and grew and grew. And that was just a really great way to start conversations about diversity and to educate and to have a bit of fun. So again, just to be, just sometimes just think outside of the box about how to spread the word.
My take is continue to create a global set of values. Why are we doing this? Because that will actually glue people, but understand local realities, celebrate those differences, and highlight wherever you can the impact on product. One of my favorite stories in my career was when we started really hiring women and people from the LGBT community, and they changed a product altogether. Like the product became better, actually served more people. It actually had a lot of impact on brand, like really correlate what we're doing on the DEI piece to the effect on how the users actually perceive and benefit from that work. And that for me has done wonders.
And just to continue the thought, for me, it would be about adding structure. When you have many countries and many potential priorities, just taking the week or however long with the team to sit down and say, this is the structure of benchmarks that we're going to use to make our decisions will give you the space where you need to focus. There's a tool that I like that's called the Global Diversity equity and inclusion benchmarks out of like a Vegas nonprofit that you can go to that just gives you some language to add structure to your plans, because otherwise you can spend a lot of time just chasing whatever is top of mind for anyone at any given time. So I think from Jill's socialization through food all the way to a structure, we will get to change the hearts and minds of folks that we need to.
Thank you all so much for taking the time for this panel today. Jill, Oana, Thomas, it's been wonderful hearing from what you're experiencing on the ground. I know that you're all very busy, and taking the time to share these lessons out with the wider community is very much appreciated. For those of you who were here attending, we'll be sending out some takeaways at the end, and we'll be hosting more similar topics and panels in the future if we hear that it's something that you value. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evenings and afternoons.
Thank you all.